UCLA's Best After School Enrichment Program, and Lupe Quinteros Grady of the Latin American Youth Center. So let's get the show on the road, and thank you so much for coming. Please ask your questions in the Q&A functions, and we'll try and cover those. Welcome to the Nonprofit Report, your weekly update on nonprofit organizations, issues, and leaders. I'm your host, Mark Oppenheim, and today we will talk about the importance of building diversity in the arts, and particularly in the performing arts, with guests Everett McCorvey, Professor and Director of Opera at the University of Kentucky College of Fine Arts, and Jose Luis Valenzuela, Artistic Director at the Latino Theatre Center. A reminder to Zoom attendees that we will take 3 snap polls during the show, and we'll announce results. And questions submitted to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen will be included in our discussion. So thank you, Everett. Thank you, Jose Luis, for joining us. It is wonderful to have you, and particularly because of what I have just experienced. I've apologized for it. We'll go over that. But before we talk about that particular situation, I just wanted to sort of tee this up because racial and ethnic demographics of the paid arts workforce, it's just strikingly similar to what it was a generation ago, 2 generations ago, 3 generations ago, with a majority identifying as Hispanic non-white. And the audience mix also frequently follows the same pattern, and there must be change to be more inclusive. So I recently was personally involved in a situation and that received its share of press attention, and we'll talk about that. But before we do, let's talk about how you each have experienced disparities in the arts based in race. And Everett, do you mind teeing this off? Because it's just such an important topic.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you for having me on this important webinar, and I appreciate all of your efforts to raise the discussion about these areas. I have had the opportunity to work with several major nonprofit organizations, in addition to my work as director of opera at the University of Kentucky, where we are almost an independent company with a budget to present world-class opera. I'm also the founder and director of the American Spiritual Ensemble, which is a performing choir that performs all over the world and celebrates the American Negro spiritual. And I'm also the artistic director of the National Chorale in New York City. And so I've had a lot of experience and work with diversifying organizations and helping to answer this question about how one diversifies the arts and addresses the systemic racism that still happens in the arts. And so I'm looking forward to talking about that.
You know, this is such a big problem, isn't it, Jose Luis? You've had a career arc where you've seen so much. Talk about what you have seen in your arc and how you are addressing that.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. Yes, I work with big white institutions and internationally work as a director, and I have the Latino Theatre Company for 35 years, and I'm a distinguished professor from UCLA from the School of Theatre, Film, and Television. So, as you know, it's been a big, amazing journey and experience in racism and seeing how difficult it's to bring people of color. I was the head of the MFA directing program for 25 years. I think I had 1 African-American student in my program in 25 years, okay? And 5 Latinos. And I think it's so important to talk about how the system, it's all designed to not bring people of color into it. And also, I mean, we have to talk about the educational program. The actual educational system that is based on all Western culture. It doesn't allow any relationship to the communities that we're talking about in many, many, many ways. I think it's so complicated, and it's an old-fashioned educational system. It was designed in the 1950s, and it haven't changed. It's 60 years ago, if not longer than that, especially in the arts. I'm talking, especially in theater, and, and in film, if you wanted. So I think the work that we have to do as leaders in the community, as leaders in the academia or in the nonprofit work, is immense. I mean, it's not easy. I want to talk a little bit about what happened with you, because it happens with all this coded language that exists in our work, in our world, and that we have to analyze and take them away, because if not, that's what we call the gatekeepers for people of color coming into the performing arts.
Yeah, and this is where we stumbled. We took a point from their position descriptions into ours. It should never have made it through the filters. We focused elsewhere. We edited, the first couple of pages, and then it was brought to our attention. We didn't even recognize the words. And then when we kind of figured it out, which happened at about 12:30 in the morning, a few hours later, we together actually with the principals at our clients put that down. And it was a lapse. If I say anything more, it'll sound like an excuse. It isn't. I take full responsibility. So the question becomes, as a perpetrator, I am a perpetrator, okay? I am a problem. How do I make a change? How do you make a change? How do we make a change? How does the system make a change? Everett, opera is as bad as ballet, as bad as theater, as bad as the symphonic arts, as bad as the museum sector. Every single sector has to change. How do we deal with this, Everett?
Well, I want to go with something that Professor Valenzuela said when he talked about the gatekeepers. One of the things that we have to do is we have to have more gatekeepers who are diverse. Part of the problem that I have seen in opera for years is that you may have a few operatic singers, but you have very few opera administrators. And so diversity has to be intentional. It can't be happenstance. It has to be planned. And so, but if there are no gatekeepers who are diverse, then it makes it difficult to change the system, because there's no one in the system that then realizes that there must be change. And so if there are people in the system who are gatekeepers, who can look at language and say, wait a minute, this is racist language, who can look at auditions and who can look at opportunities and say, we must have a diverse cast. We must have people of color in the decision-making positions so that we can identify systemic racism when it happens. Because as you were saying, Mark, part of the problem comes in that sometimes a lot of times, people who are in those decision-making positions, they're okay with the language. They don't see anything wrong with the language. And so unfortunately, what then happens is like what happened with your organization. But one of the ways to change that, obviously, is to get more diverse gatekeepers, more diverse people who are in decision-making positions, and then empower them to make those decisions.
Jose Luis?
I think it's so important. Yeah, it's very, very important to me. I think that's key for most organizations. I work at the Music Center. I work in big theaters all over the country. And that's the biggest issue that you encounter. One, in a nonprofit organization like ours, you have to diversify your board. And it's so important. It's so important. And not only in the idea that, and they have this, because they look for the people who can give you big checks, and if there is people of color, and if that's one person of color who can, then you bring them into the board. Well, that's an issue too, because diversifying the board, it's not necessarily having a token person in there who is going to agree with you and everything, because it's going to be doing business with you and everything. It's about the idea that you're trying to diversify the voice and the board about the work that you do and the performing arts. And then again, we all know right now everybody's going crazy in the theaters. I'm talking about theaters getting an associate artistic director of color who has no power. It's just a title. No, give them power, give them a budget, give them a program, tell them, because if you have no power at all, it doesn't mean anything. I mean, I work in these institutions for years. I left institutions because of this issue, because I didn't want to fight inside the institution. I can do much more better. And you know, it's so much work to do. It's been incredible. And we have to push every day, every day. It's been a struggle or saying, why? In or I was in a commission for the LA County art, for the LA County, you know, and we have one of the biggest budgets in the country.
Right.
And, you know, and so in our county, the county itself was giving money to the arts organizations in the LA, $100 million a year, which is really not a lot for the type of budget that we have, but who was going to 4 institutions, 4 white institutions, and another 300 nonprofits, arts organizations were getting, each one of, meaning $80 million were annually going to these 4 institutions, and $20 million were going to 400 art institutions.
Right. So you see the imbalance right there. It's in the funding. You know, one of the things that we've done is we feel very strongly on a couple of levels. First of all, our staff is very diverse, right? In this particular case, it happened to be me working with his client, but we try to have the staff look like America. We have people of different ages, and ages is different. I was just talking with one of our colleagues, and she was saying, look, you know, frankly, the people who are older don't get it. The people who are younger get it, right? And the people who are older have their perspective, right? So they're also different perspectives. The other thing that we did, and I was talking about this with Jose Luis before you came on, Everett, is that from the very beginning, we encourage clients to not use pedigree as a filter, because pedigree contains systemic bias.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
How do you see that? Because you're both educators, right?
Mm-hmm.
You both actually award degrees.
Mm-hmm.
How do you see that? Because what we've been trying to do from the very beginning, we've said search by results, not by pedigree.
Mm-hmm.
Go beyond usual suspects. We've argued within clients. We also go to places where change is needed, where there are problems, right? We put ourselves into the middle of a battle, and we stumbled in this case. Everett, how do you see it as someone who awards degrees in terms of this pedigree situation?
Well, you know, one of the things that I'm in education, obviously. So when I'm working with people of color who come from maybe a disenfranchised background, I encourage them to get degrees, because when you have degrees, then you have a status that they can't take away from you. I mean, I remember when I first started teaching, going to at another university, and it was a white university. And as I walked into the classroom, you know, you had a white professor that says, "I am Dr. So-and-so." And the class would say, "Okay, that's great." I walk into the classroom, I say, "I am Dr. So-and-so. I'm Dr. McCorvey." Their first question is, "Okay, prove it." And I think that's the difference that we've got to get out of the system, so that everybody has and this is what you're talking about, that pedigree versus experience. And but a lot of people of color don't have the experience that they need, because those doors haven't been opened for them yet, and the opportunity for those doors. I know in opera companies now, because of the Black Lives Matter movement, more opera companies are looking at hiring DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion officers, to help them to look into their company and figure out where the systemic racism is happening. Some companies, Houston, there are several companies in different parts of the country that are now hiring artistic administrators and of color to help them with the casting of The Metropolitan Opera has just hired a diversity officer. So there are companies now, because of Black Lives Matter, which is amazing young people's movement. Because of that, I think I call it the second civil rights movement, actually. I grew up during the first civil rights movement in Montgomery, Alabama, which is where I'm from. And my parents were very involved in the civil rights movement. I call this the second civil rights movement. And this one is fueled by young people and a lot of young white people who are looking at this situation and saying, this is not right. We've got to do better as a country. And so I look forward to organizations, nonprofits that continue to hire diversity, equity, inclusion officers and have training so that we can identify systemic racism as it's happening and remove that from the performing arts and the nonprofit organizations.
Go ahead, Jose Luis.
Yeah, I mean, where do I begin about? I don't have a degree. I don't have a terminal degree. I became famous in Europe. This is what I'm talking about. I was a director that I did a lot of work in Europe in my early age. I was involved with the Chicano movement in the United States, which was like the civil rights movement, you know, at the time, part of the civil rights movement. And happened to be directing in major theaters around the nation and internationally. And the university called me to become the head of the MFA directing program 25 years ago. You know, because it was UCLA School of Theater and Film Television is a professional school, you know, and even though it's one of the greatest research universities in the world, these particular departments are professional schools. So it was only professional people who were in the field teaching. You know, that was an experience. But this is how bad the system is. Okay, this is so funny. I just retired 2 years ago, and I live in Los Angeles. We have a community in East LA that is, you know, we are 51% of the population. Again, I mean, in 25 years, I have 5 Latinos to be in my program. You know, it's totally impossible to get into these MFA programs. And we'll talk about what is the reason. So it's how I'm gonna work with my community college. I want to work with my people. I'm going to work in the community. I'm going to offer a class. I'm going to go talk to them. I talk to the chancellor of the district, and I say, you know, I have these classes about history. I've been doing. I'm a distinguished professor, and he knew me who I was. He goes, oh, that's fantastic. So he goes, but you know, we need to hire you. I say, you don't have to hire me. Let's figure out where I do the class. So you cannot be hired in a community college because you don't have an MFA. So by that means, I say I'm a distinguished professor. Right? Agus Wilson will never be able to teach in a community college. He didn't have an MFA.
Well, there you go, right? I mean, it's that use of pedigree to create a barrier, and it's not out of ill will. That's the real reason that we argue against that. Even when we do university searches, we did a university search for a provost and executive vice chancellor at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts, and you'll appreciate this. They did not create that barrier. The person who was recruited was Patrick Sims, who comes out of the theater, an African-American man coming out of the University of Wisconsin. Right? The avoidance of those barriers are so important. How do we create that consciousness that leads to not having that discussion, to having, Jose Luis, somebody like yourself there to create the transformation? Because if there's a barrier to transformation, that's where it is.
That's what I'm talking. I mean, we need to change the system. Meaning, we really have to go to the root of the system that it was based on racism. It was based on the idea. I mean, come on, this thing about artistic excellence. What's the meaning of that? What do that means in the world? It's incredible to me that we still use it. You know, we still the idea that you have to have artistic excellence, and who is the judge? Who is the judge about that? We have to, now they use all these coded words in order mean, I'm in a meeting with a bunch of artistic directors, and we're talking about diversity. And I say, well, this is what you have to do. You have to hire people in your administration and put people of color in your board. And I mean, this is the way you're going to change it. And they go, but do they exist? A racist statement in itself.
That is so true. I mean, how many times have we heard, well, we would like to hire someone of color, but we don't know anybody because we don't think they're out there. And I'm saying, are you kidding me? Absolutely, they're out there. But again, it has to be intentional. It has to be something that people are willing to say, I want to go out and search for the best people in this for this position in all races. And because if somebody says to me that the person is not out there, my response typically is, in my mind, you just don't want to work. And because the people are out there.
Well, it goes so very deep. I have been, again, as I said, we go where the battles need to be fought. So we've gone to places where these issues have been avoided for centuries, and we have those discussions. We've been in environments in which we go around and we look at museums and we say, look, all of the artists of color, they're here, but they're all hung in hallways and in little corners. We've said that, and you could hear a pin drop. We've been in situations where people have said, look, we'd like to have someone of color on the board, but right. It's wealth and big checks or whatever the barrier is, right? We have those discussions and we function as advocates, but the change is there's so many different barriers. I think we have to keep fighting, but let's talk about what needs to be done systemically. Let's talk about the board, let's talk about the staff, and let's talk about education. Do you want to start with education, or do you want to start with board and funding?
Well, if you're talking about professional organizations, I think you have to start with the board. Because that is a very important place, because the artistic director is going to obey the will of the board. And so if the board members are not diverse and there's not a diversity of thought from the board, then there's not going to be an artistic will to make changes at the artistic level. So for me, I think that we have to start working at the board level to create a more diverse board.
Jose Luis, how do you see it?
Well, I think it's in the board. Of course, I think we have to start. But I want to talk about the diversity of the board. I have a board. I have a Latino board because I have a Latino organization, who does multicultural programming, but I have a Latino board. And the big institutions, the big museums, if I have 2 or 3 great board members, they come and take them away and put them in their institutions. Now, this is board that are nurtured, that I got from the community, a businessman or an entrepreneur, and I say, you have to be in the board of the arts. And let's figure out, it takes years to nurture these board members. They move into these big organizations, now white organizations, and then they transform into this not community board, because they're professional boards who begins to say, no, you give me the $100,000 that I need you as you're committed, but this is a business, and it goes through this circle. It's a business right now. This is a business, and it's not necessarily an arts, the music center or LACMA. I say, how is that a business? They lose millions of dollars every year. They're subsidized by millions of dollars from the county and from the state and the federal funding. It's very easy for them to talk about being a business, when organizations of color are suffering for funding. And they're taking away the great board members that can be in organizations of color.
So what your point is that it is fundamental in the funding models of how these organizations function, and we can change we can have a search firm that is diverse and has all sorts of different people and sensibilities. And even you can have artists, you can even have managers in there, but we really have to go down to the fundamentals and really query the entire model of how these organizations actually function. Is that your take as well, Everett?
Yeah, well, I think that one of the things that we can consider when you're working on diversifying your board is, a lot of boards, what they do is they look for people who have the financial resources to help keep the company afloat. But what I try to do with the boards, I work with 3 different boards in my 3 different organizations, and what I try to do in all 3 of those organizations is to say, let's have a model where we have categories so that you do have some of those high dollar, if you have a board of, I'll just take another, 12, you might have 4 or 5 who are high dollar board members, but you also may have 1 or 2 positions for accountants, 1 or 2 positions for bankers, 1 or 2 positions for community people, so that you'll have some people who don't have the financial resources to be particularly on a particular board, but what the other things that they bring to the board are just as important. And so if you bring a community person that has a wide net of people that they get to work with, that's as important as that person who has a lot of money that's on the board. So I think by having categories, you can always make sure that you have a place at the table for everyone in the community.
This is so interesting because this is exactly how Wikipedia functions. We did a lot of transformational work at Wikipedia, and Wikipedia does have exactly that approach. We also just finished 2 polls. We're doing a 3rd right now. The first poll had 96% of the people thinking that there was an imbalance for people of color. And then the second poll asked whether we need a fundamental change where we change everything all at once, a targeted change, which is on a time frame, but very driven, or evolutionary change. And 56% of the people said targeted change where there's a time frame, and 30% said fundamental change. So we have basically 82% of the respondents. I mean, all the people who responded said that change was necessary because that was the nature of the question. But 82% of the respondents felt that it was either fundamental or very driven change that is required. Let's talk a little. Everett, did you want to make another point?
Well, I think that second poll is very interesting because if you think about that, that's really true. I mean, that's a great way of looking at it. You have to have, that's saying we have to have short-term change and we have to have long-term change. And I think as organizations are looking, they shouldn't try to plan to change everything all at once, because you have to have that plan. It's like having a 3-year plan and a long-range plan of 5 years, so that the organization over a period of time can make those important changes that need to be made. So I'm very excited about your audience because, man, they are with it.
I know we have no time anymore, but I think it's 8:30 already. I think it's half an hour. Is that what it's going to be? I want to say, you guys, we have to look at the curriculum and the universities and institutions like that. It's all old-fashioned. That needs to be changed. Meaning, it's totally. You go to any arts education, there is no such. If there is a diversity class, it's like an elective. It's not part of the curriculum. They're not teaching. We're not teaching the young people the true history. There is no canon that includes people of color in the arts, and in all the arts, in the visual arts and the performing arts, and it's so crucial if we really want to make a the schools, the educational system has to look at the curriculum of every university in this country and change that. That is going to create a change.
And it was your point, right? So, Jose Luis, and August Wilson is my playwright. I need to learn his works.
That's
right.
right.
I'm going to ask you one last question because we are coming to the end of our time, as you correctly point out. And I want to ask the question of tokenism. One of our viewers asked the question, and there is this issue of tokenism. Is DEI, the creation of a DEI office, does that sort of become the token thing, right? Is the appointment of one person or two people on the board or creating reserved seats, is that the token that prevents change? Can we talk a little bit about that? Because we see, and you've put forth sort of a DEI office, Everett, as a valid approach. And then there are other people who think that's an invalid approach, that it's a brief that everyone should carry. Everett, why don't you start, because you're jumping out of your seat?
I am, because, I just remember when I first started at the University of Kentucky, which is where I'm teaching, the local student newspaper said, interviewed me, and they said, well, how do you feel about being an affirmative action hire? Because, back 30 years ago, it was affirmative action. And so they said, how do you feel about being an affirmative action hire? I said, I feel fine about that because I'm qualified. I know that I'm up to the task of this position. What affirmative action did was just open the door for people of color to have an opportunity. Once the door was open, it's still up to us to walk through the door and be successful. And so for me, if we choose, I'm thinking 30 years now down the road, we're at DEI. So if that is going to open the door to identify systemic racism, I'm totally fine with that, because the system, as Jose Luis says, the system needs to change. And the other thing that I'll say in terms of tokenism is that if you're going to hire at a university, hire more than one. I always use the adage at our university that Noah brought the animals into the ark 2 by 2. And so if you're going to hire one, at least hire two so that they can talk, and because their experience is going to be very different from the majority experience in an institution. And so getting the numbers up is very, very important.
Thank you. We started with you, Everett. Jose Luis, let's end with you. Let's give you the final word.
Now we're talking about EDI and talking about the idea of tokenism and affirmative action. I think EDI, I think the discussion is so complicated and difficult. And we have to understand that from now on, we're gonna be in a room where we're gonna be uncomfortable about what the conversation that this country is having, meaning we all have to understand that. What you're going through, Mark, is gonna happen every day to a lot of people in this country and the institution, especially in the nonprofit world. So I think it's important to understand EDI becomes a place where you can actually have a mediator in the idea of the conversation. I think that's why it's important, because the conversation is going to happen, even if nobody wants or not. It's happening now. And it's nothing but it's going to be but increase. So what's important, I think, with the ADI is that allows a platform for the conversation between the parties and being able to create a dialogue, and not necessarily, it's not an imposition, because imposing something is not going to change nothing. It's the idea that we are going to introduce this new thought that the organization is changing and people are going to rule.
What a great thought. Jose Luis, thank you so much. Artistic Director of the Latino Theatre Center, and Everett McCorvey, Professor and Director of Opera at the University of Kentucky College of Fine Arts. As for myself, I apologize again for our errors. We play very close to this fire of change. And if you play close to the fire, you get burned. You get burnt and you get burnt and you get burned. And we need to learn how to be close to that fire, handle it, and not be consumed by it, yet still change. So thank you so much, you both, for helping to inform us, to inform me. That's the nonprofit report. Thank you.